Greetings, brethren, CloakingDonkey here, and today let's talk a bit about Crowfall. As I said in my last video on Crowfall, the game has finally piqued my interest. I was a bit wary in the past, but I really do want to take a bit more of an in-depth look over the next couple of weeks and months to see what makes this game tick and how I like it in contrast to Camelot Unchained and the other games that will be forthcoming in this here glorious MMORPG genre. And so first let's look at a brand new idea that the Crowfall team has, and that they are going to be testing in the upcoming playtest that is going to start sometime this week, I believe. And that is a brand new faction system. As you might know, Crowfall is a game that has various game modes, as you can join all sorts of different worlds with your characters, and these worlds will persist for weeks or months or however long the campaign is set. And at some point the campaign will conclude, at which point you can take your character into another campaign. And all of these different campaigns will have different game modes. There might be completely open PvP ones, where everybody's by themselves and you're allowed to make teams with your friends, of course, but you can fight whoever you wish, there are no restrictions whatsoever. Other servers may have a guild PvP system, where guilds go and then compete against each other, and other servers may have faction systems. And this being the nature of Crowfall, this ability to change the game based on whatever campaign you currently play, does of course also give them the opportunity to try out different game modes all the time. Because let's face it, with a little less permanence to the PvP system in the game, that aspect of seeing the fruits of your labors arise and fall over time is not going to be quite as dramatic as in a game like Camelot Unchained, for example, where the permanence of everything you do is really most of the pull of that game. And so without that, in my opinion, it's actually going to be variety that really is going to set Crowfall apart. And they do really need to hammer home on that, in my opinion, and really make sure that they have as many different game modes throughout their various campaigns as they can have, just to make sure that there's a lot of different things you as a player can choose to do. And so for this coming playtest, they are doing an experiment for a faction system that is slightly different to what you may be used to. It is a 3-faction system, but unlike in games such as Elder Scrolls Online, Dark Age of Camelot, PlanetSide, and Guild Wars 2, these factions are not going to be equal. Usually, a 3-faction system just means you have 3 factions that fight each other all the time for exactly the same reasons. However, their proposition is to have 3 factions where 2 of them fight each other, namely Chaos and Order, and then to have the 3rd faction, Balance, true to their name, try to balance out the conflict. So where Chaos and Order always try to bring each other down to further their goals, it is actually going to be Balance's goal to attack whichever faction is currently dominating to make sure that the bar swings back into their favor. On the screen you can see the slider that they proposed, and you can see that it is really more of a tug of war, where Balance and Order are really trying to swing things in their direction, but Balance are trying to keep it exactly in the middle, and if they can keep it in the middle, that's their win condition. And that is of course going to make it much harder for Chaos and Order to succeed, because while at some points Balance might be fighting on their side, then they might turn on them in the middle of a fight because, well, the power might be swinging toward Chaos, and, well, Balance obviously doesn't want that because, well, they want it to be balanced. And I definitely think that this is a very interesting idea. Now, without having actually seen the playtest live, I think there are going to be some issues with this straight up. And that is when you have Order and Chaos trying to have as many strongholds each as possible, that's kind of a straight up faction fight as we might be used from other games. But Balance is not actually trying to get strongholds for themselves, they are just trying to keep the balance between Chaos and Order. So they are really just kind of a helping faction most of the time. Now, this can certainly be interesting for people who are not necessarily that interested in sieging castles all the time and just maybe swooping in at the last moment and routing out the attackers or helping overwhelm the defenders, depending on, where the balance needs to be. But I'm certainly interested to see how that turns out long term, how interesting that sort of playstyle is going to be in the long run, because when you don't really capture and hold castles yourself and really just always end up on the side that is currently losing, it feels more like you're playing a mercenary. Now, I'm not saying that is not an interesting thing by itself, it certainly is an interesting concept. It's just something I'm going to actually have to see in action. Now the next problem is of course that just by looking at it, if all three factions are equal in size, which I don't know if that is going to be the case, again with balance not being a main faction, so to speak. I do think that maybe a lot of people will just choose to play Order or Chaos instead. And so balance might end up being a smaller faction, and then that would be okay. But if all three factions were equally sized, then really whatever faction balance joins just becomes overwhelmingly powerful, and so it will actually be really difficult for Order and Chaos to ever win, because for balance to win they really just need to throw their entire power onto one side and then absolutely overwhelm and crush the other side, which would then very easily keep the power in balance. And the question is also, of course, how fun is it really going to be? Say you are Chaos and you just had a really good push and you captured a couple of castles, and then all of a sudden the entire balance faction joins Order and just steamrolls the crap out of you because there's so many people that you just cannot win against them. Is that really going to be that fun, that you get immediately punished as soon as you have a little bit of success by just this incredibly overwhelming number of players that suddenly swoop down on you? I don't know, and it's going to be certainly interesting. Now, having played a lot of these RVR, realm versus realm type games in the past, I can certainly say that these alliances usually are very fickle. Because usually what happens in pretty much every 3-faction RVR game is that you will have one faction that is a little bit weaker than the other two. Mostly we'll have one faction that is somehow the strongest, and the second one will be relatively close, and you will have probably one that's a little bit behind the other two. On my server in PlanetSide 1, for example, the underdogs were always the Vanu, and on my server in Dark Age of Camelot, it was Hibernia. And the overwhelming faction would sometimes have to be defeated simply by allying with the second biggest faction. But generally these pacts, because they were formed between, several guilds within the faction, would be very fragile indeed. So as long as that is how it works in Crowfall, that balance doesn't actually just, flip a switch and now they are physically allied with Order, and they really just have to manually kind of see to it that, things happen in a specific way to, make them win in the end, then I don't really have that big of a problem with it. Again, we'll have to really see how it turns out live on the servers. I think the system could be really cool, because I do find it interesting to have a third faction that doesn't actually capture stuff for themselves, but they capture it, to swing the power pendulum in the other direction. I find that very intriguing. So while I certainly have my reservations, I can't wait to see how it turns out. And if you want to see how it turns out, you can obviously subscribe, as I will be certain to make a video about this as soon as this campaign is in full swing. And you can also head on over to twitch.tv/CloakingDonkey and follow me there, as I will certainly also be streaming this coming Crowfall campaign, as I am now also a backer of this game. But remember, and yes, that means I did spend a bunch of money on this game now, and that should of course mean to you that my opinion isn't quite as objective anymore as it used to be. So just like with Camelot Unchained, certainly take my opinions with a grain of salt, and remember that I spent money on this, and even if I'm trying to be as objective as possible and try to give it my honest criticism, there surely is going to be a bit of subconscious bias toward this game, as well, I'm invested in it now, right? But as you know, if you have followed my content, I try to be as objective as possible, and even when I spend a bunch of money on the game, I usually still rag on its faults quite harshly. And Crowfall will certainly not be an exception to this, because if this campaign thing turns out to be bad, I'm gonna be sure to let everybody know that I think it's bad. Alright, thank you everyone for watching, stay tuned for more MMO content, but until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey and I'll see you in another video!